Okay, so moving along in Spengler, I want to look at not the political chart this time. I want to look at the first chart that he gives, Table 1, Contemporary Spiritual Epochs, by which he means the evolution of the intellect in each of these civilizations as they move from religious and poetic cosmologies and epics to metaphysically inclined philosophy, to rational, metaphysically inclined philosophy, and then finally to banal, sort of cosmopolitan thinking along the lines of socialism or sort of Jeremy Bentham style, greatest good for the greatest number, just very banal. The attempt to solve social problems becomes the concern of philosophy in the 19th century, for instance, which displaces the previous concern with grand metaphysical traditions. So there's a morphology there. And it parallels the morphology that we've just seen with the evolution of the art in each of these four civilizations, except that now, and this is significant, this might, it can slip by you very easily here. He's got four civilizations again here, but instead of the Egyptian civilization, he's got the Indian, the Hindu civilization, compared with the classical, the Arabian, and the Western. The reason for that, and I think this is something that escaped Spengler at the time that he wrote this, but occurred to him later on, the problem of the Indo-Aryan invasions, which is to say that the Indo-Aryan invasions of the second millennium, from about 2000 BC down to 1200 BC, represent a caesura, almost a kind of interregnum, between what Toynbee would call the first generation of civilization, which consists of Egypt, Minoan Crete, Harappa, and the Sumerians, as the first generation of civilization, none of which were philosophically inclined. So he can't use any of those as part of his model here because philosophy never developed in the first generation of civilization. It didn't develop until the second generation, which consists of, the second generation consists of the classical, the Greek civilization, the Arabian civilization actually is a kind of third generation, and the Western also a third generation along with the Arabian. But the Greeks, the Hindus, the Persians, and the Chinese all represent a second generation, and all are philosophically inclined, all have a history of philosophy, and I believe very strongly that has to do with the Indo-Aryan mentality that in each of these cases, in China it wasn't Indo-Aryan, but nonetheless chariot-riding steppe nomads, basically the same thing. These others were all invaded by the Indo-Aryans, and they brought somehow, I'm not quite sure how, but they brought a philosophical dimension to these civilizations when they fused together with the old dying behemoths of the first generation of civilization, fused together with them, and then produced intellectually inclined civilizations as the second, and then later the third generation of civilization. So there's a reason why he substitutes out Egypt for India here. So what I want to do is go through these four then in comparison. This is the model where he has a spring phase, a summer phase, an autumn phase, and a winter phase. And the spring phase, he says, is rural intuitive, great creations of the newly awakened dream-heavy soul, superpersonal unity and fullness. And this has two phases. The first phase of this springtime period, which corresponds to the pre-cultural as well as the early cultural, I think. The birth of a myth of the grand style, expressing a new God feeling, world fear, and world longing. This comes in India, 1500 BC, with the Vedic religion. The Vedic religion comes in. They are the descendants of Indo-Aryans who have come in and migrated and intermixed with the Harappan civilization. They come in to inaugurate this sort of dreamlike phase where they have Aryan hero tales that eventually become the stories of Rama and the characters of the Pandava brothers and the Mahabharata, eventually later on. This corresponds to the classical period of Homer. The Homeric mythos is the proper mythological world of the Greeks. along with all the various local Heracles and Theseus legends and so forth. And then the Arabian is the year 0 to 300, and this includes primitive Christianity, such as the Gnostics and the early Jewish Christians, and above all, the Gospels and the various apocalyptic literatures that were invented by the Hebrews going back to 160 BC, about the time of the Maccabean revolts. Apocalyptic literature comes in, and the Gospels are written. So the Gospels are the mythos of the Arabian, the Magian civilization. They correspond to the Homeric mythos, which corresponds to the Vedic mythos in India. And then in the West, of course, this is the period of German Catholicism. It's the period of the Eddas and the great Aryan hero tales there with Siegfried slaying the dragon, all that material that Wagner will later, at the tail end of our civilization, go back to and pillage for his operas. And then we get monks like Bernard of Clairvaux and Joachim of Flores, and so forth. So this is the period of the creation of these epics. Epic literature that's tied in very closely with the creation of a new religious world outlook. The second phase of this is he characterizes as the earliest mystical metaphysical shaping of the new world outlook and the zenith of scholasticism. He says in India this is preserved in the oldest parts of the Vedas. The oldest of the Vedas, and I've read it, is the Rig Veda. I've read the entire thing. It's huge. I don't remember much about it having a scholastic feel to it, so I'm not quite sure what he's talking about there. With the classical, this is the period of the Orphics, the oldest of the Orphic cults, and cosmologically he's got Hesiod here now instead of Homer. Hesiod's about a century later from Homer. And then in the Arabian world, this corresponds to Father Origen, Plotinus, Mani, Iamblichus, all these sort of early post-Gnostic philosophers who are you no longer have this impersonal world of all these anonymous Gnostics, or we don't know who wrote any of those texts. Now we start getting individuals like Plotinus who come in and who writes the Enneads, and Plotinus didn't like the Gnostics, but nonetheless he represents a kind of rational, mystical reaction against them with the formation of a kind of a system, a very clear system. So individuals like Origen, Mani, who founds Manichaeanism, all start coming in now, who are individual philosophers inheriting these impersonal traditions that were authored by anonymous individuals and shaping them into unique world cosmologies. This corresponds, of course, in the West to Dante. Dante corresponds to Hesiod, and these guys, Plotinus, creating a whole Christian cosmology, as well as the philosophers of Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Meister Eckhart. This is the period of the great scholastics who are trying to reconcile reason and mysticism, reason and belief. So they're very concerned with reconciling the Aristotelian tradition based on rationalism and reason with the Christian emphasis on belief. And that wraps up the springtime period when these new religious mentalities all come into being. And it shifts to the summer phase, where he says, now we have a ripening consciousness, the earliest urban and critical stirrings. Slowly, these civilizations become ever more and more urban. They move from a rural countryside mentality. Hesiod was a farmer, a landlocked farmer, to towns, bringing in early capitalist economies, at least in the West, anyway. So he's got phase 3 here, which is the first of the summer phases, Reformation, internal popular opposition to the great springtime forms. So there's a bit of a contradiction that now comes in, and the culture starts reacting against the early springtime forms in India with the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas and the oldest of the Upanishads. The two oldest of the Upanishads are the Chandogya Upanishad and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And the thing about them is that they very much do, the Upanishads, more so than the Brahmanas, the Upanishads very much do represent, A, the birth of Indian philosophy, and B, a complete reaction against the world of the Vedas. Those two early Upanishads detail the hero Yajnavalkya, whose name, as it implies Yajna, is the teacher of yoga. he brings yoga and meditation in and makes a fool out of the Brahmin priests, and shows that you don't need their religion to attain spirituality. You can attain it through moksha, or going into samadhi and unifying the Atman soul with the Brahman oversoul. So that is a reaction against the springtime forms there. Same thing with the Orphics in the classical civilization and the Dionysiac religion. The Orphics are in many ways, very un-Greek. They believed in reincarnation. They had a very anti-Greek, anti-Homeric cosmology that just doesn't fit the way that you think that it would. And then with the Arabian, we get Augustine coming in now, and the Nestorians coming in with these late transformations of Christianity into a number of different species. The Nestorians, the Monophysites, and their various transformations in the ecclesiastic councils that are held, each of which is arguing out the dogma of what the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost are. Are they a Trinity? Is it one God with two separate gods? What is it? So that is part of the opposition to the springtime forms in the Arabian Magian culture. And then in the West, of course, this consists of individuals like Nicholas Cusanus, John Huss, who is one of the first Protestants, in a sense, Savonarola, who also is foreshadowing a kind of puritanical mentality, and Luther and Calvin. The Protestants come in now, and they represent this reaction against the springtime forms of, let's say, German Catholicism or Southern Mediterranean Catholicism, just as Orphism represented a rejection of the Homeric tradition, just as the Upanishads represented a rejection of the Vedic tradition. So those are all morphologically analogous. The second phase of the summer period is the beginnings of a purely philosophical, now we're shifting from religion to philosophy, a purely philosophical form of the world feeling, and the opposition of idealistic and realistic systems. He says this is preserved in the Upanishads, probably the later Upanishads, which tend to get more and more philosophical. Then in the classical world, this is the realm of the pre-Socratics now. So the pre-Socratics are coming in. And in many ways, I think the Upanishads do correspond to the pre-Socratics. And then in the Magian Arabian world, he's got Byzantine, Jewish, Syrian, Coptic, and Persian literature of the 6th and 7th centuries. I think a lot of that can be found in that very big 2-volume anthology called Old Testament, or is it Biblical Pseudepigrapha? It's just jam-packed with all these obscure texts from all these varying traditions during that period. And then in our pre-Socratics in the West are, of course, Galileo, Francis Bacon, Descartes, Giordano Bruno, Jakob Boehme, and even Leibniz. Those are sort of our pre-Socratics, who are still have one foot in the religious world and one foot in the philosophical world. It's not rationalistic yet. It's still thoroughly metaphysical. In the next phase, he has the formation of a new mathematic conception of number as copy and content of world forms. So now, mathematics begins, as the intellect in the civilization is waking up, mathematics begin to come in and are expressed consciously as expressions of the world soul of each of these cultures, just as earlier the architecture had done so, had been architectural expressions of the world soul of each of these cultures. This is lost, he says, in India, but that's no surprise. We've lost, the Hindus just didn't care. We've lost so much of their stuff. But this is the period of the Pythagoreans in the classical civilization, and the rise of geometry and arithmetic, in which number is magnitude, and it corresponds, it's very sensuous and Euclidean, and corresponds to the classical emphasis on the physicality of the body. And then we get, of course, algebra in the Arabian civilization with the mysterious number, the XYZ, that represents a mysterious substance. So we have form and matter being expressed as the opposition with the Greeks. Here we have substance and attribute as a basic alchemical expression of the Arabian mathematic. And then, of course, in the West, then, this is the period of the creation of infinitesimal calculus by Newton and Leibniz. And number now becomes function, and now we have forces moving masses about, as in the case of Newton's idea of gravity. Okay, and then it finishes off the summer period, he says, finishes off with the rise of Puritanism, rationalistic, mystic impoverishment of religion now, with the Pythagorean society, not Pythagoras himself, but the Pythagorean society. In India, this is lost again. And then this corresponds to the rise of Muhammad, and in the Western civilization to the English Puritans, Cromwell especially. He sees Cromwell, Muhammad, and Pythagoras as morphologically analogous individuals. They all set to purifying the religion and reforming it and trying to get it back to its original springtime purity. So that's the summer period of the intellectual phase of the civilization. Now we have the autumn period, which he describes as the intelligence of the city. Now, the city thinking, city intellect now begins to take over. The zenith of strict intellectual creativeness. So this corresponds in the intellectual world to what we had seen last time as the apotheosis of the artistic world, classical music from Bach to Mozart, let's say, or Praxiteles in sculpture. This is the intellectual equivalent of the apogee of the culture. The Enlightenment comes in. And now we begin to get the belief in the almightiness of reason and the cult of nature and rational religion, like deism, for instance, is a rational religion. But now we have the Socratic man comes on stage. Now he's borrowed this concept from Nietzsche. And so in India, he's got the Buddha there, as well as the Sankhya philosophical system, the sutras, and the later Upanishads. But primarily the Buddha, I think. For him, the Buddha represents a kind of application of rationalism to religion. It's nihilistic. Early Buddhism gets rid of all the gods, gets rid of the soul. There is no self. There's just a flame, a burning flame that can be blown out. Nirvana. Blow that out, and you're done. You can get out of the world, out of the cycle of samsara, which is, as far as he's concerned, the beginnings of a nihilistic tendency in India. Buddhism, as far as Spengler concerns, is Socratic in that sense. So the Socratic man is always nihilistic about earlier culture forms. And then so we have the sophists of the 5th century in the classical tradition. There's Socrates, right on there. The guy who comes in and questions everything, sterilizes all the myths, gets rid of them, cuts everything off from its roots in metaphysical tradition, and it's just pure city intellect. And then we have the rise of the Mutazilites, Nizam and Al-Kindi. I believe Al-Kindi is a mathematician, as far as I remember, in the Arabian culture. Also Sufism as a sort of mystical reaction to the rationalism. And then in our case we have the English rationalists, such as John Locke, Hume, Locke, Berkeley, and the French encyclopedists with Voltaire and Rousseau. All rationalists, all based on empirical worldviews that try to get rid of metaphysics and bring everything crashing down to the ground of banality. Then during this period we get stage 8, the zenith of mathematical thought, elucidation of the form world of numbers. In India, the concept of zero is created. We know from about this time, and only in India would they have the concept of a number that's a void, that comes out of the metaphysical tradition there of nirvana. And then we have Archytas and Plato and conic sections being worked out in the classical civilization. And then in the Islamic civilization, spherical trigonometry is worked out during that period. And then Euler and Lagrange and Laplace with the infinitesimal problem in the mathematics of the 18th century there in the West. Then we have the great conclusive systems, the final grand metaphysical systems. In India we get Vedanta, and we get the epistemology of Vaisheshika and the logic of the Nyaya system. That corresponds with Plato and Aristotle, the grand metaphysical finishers, as in the Arabian system correspond to Alfarabi and Avicenna. Those are the great finishers up of the philosophical traditions there, which correspond, of course, in our case in the West with Goethe and Kant, and Schelling, Hegel, and Fichte, the great German idealists who finish everything up. Then it shifts into the civilization period, which is what he calls the winter stage. The dawn of megalopolitan civilization, the extinction of spiritual creative force, life itself becomes a problem. Ethical practical tendencies of an irreligious and unmetaphysical cosmopolitanism. So now we have a materialistic world outlook, the cult of science, utility, and prosperity. I'm going to finish this up in a part 2 since there's a lot more to go here still.